So for this chapter, we'll be getting into the nervous system, all about brains, some sensory information, how does the brain work, how do we communicate with our body. So let's look at some things we're going to think about as we go through this. We're going to look at the 3 types of neurons. We're going to discuss briefly what neuroglia are. We're going to dive into the structure of a neuron, and then we're going to talk about the nerve impulse and what the resting and action potential is when talking about the nerve impulse. How does a nerve impulse traverse the synapse? So how does that nerve impulse travel from one neuron to the next? And then we'll look into the 2 divided sections of the nervous system. We'll look into how we protect the central nervous system. And then we'll get into the parts of the brain, their functions, some higher mental functions of the brain, and then the peripheral nervous system. So let's start off with how we organize the nervous system. Now, similar to the skeletal system, we have a division between the axial, things that are along the midline, and things that are branching off from the sides. If you remember the skeleton, we had the axial skeleton, which was mainly the skull and the vertebral column, and the appendicular skeleton, which was everything related to the limbs. We see a similar division here with the nervous system, but the names have changed. So instead of axial, anything along the midline we call the central nervous system, which is mainly just the brain and spinal cord. And then everything branching off of that is called the peripheral nervous system, which is mainly the nerves and ganglia, which are the collections of little cell bodies. So in essence, if you can remember what's in the central nervous system, mainly the brain and spinal cord, then you should know that pretty much everything else, any sort of nerve, any sort of ganglia, is going to be peripheral. And so we see that here, right? Everything we have in this kind of pinky, flesh-colored is going to be central. So we see brain and spinal cord right along here. And then everything branching off in yellow, like these nerves here coming off from the spinal cord, is part of the peripheral nervous system. And that's going to include sensory nerves, motor nerves, mixed nerves, right? Nerves that are going to help you move your muscles, nerves are going to help communicate with your digestive system, with your heart, all these different nerves that are going to help communicate with the various organs of your body are going to be part of that peripheral nervous system. So when we look at the nervous system as a whole, this really is our main control system. So we do have more than one way to control the body. The endocrine system also serves as a way to help control and communicate, but the nervous system is our rapid-fire communication and control system. This is the one that's really the overarching control mechanism that we have. And we allow for direct communication between cells. So when we look at the endocrine system later, we'll see that it's a very slow process to communicate from one organ to the next or one tissue to the next. But the nervous system is very, very fast. In the blink of an eye, you can send a message from one area of the body to another. And there's 2 cell types that are going to help us communicate like this: the neurons and the neuroglia. Let's look at the neuron first. Now, the neuron is the main cell that's going to be doing the communicating. This is the cell type that is going to be sending that nerve impulse. And there's a few structures that are important to this, its ability to do that. First, we have the cell body. And the cell body really looks kind of like the generic cell, or has a nucleus and the organelles. Think of your typical animal cell model that we've seen before, and that's generally what the cell body looks like. But coming off of that cell body, we have a few specialized structures that allow for that communication and that nerve impulse to travel. We have the dendrites, which are short extensions, and we usually have many of these. They're going to carry the nerve impulses from another neuron to the cell body. And then we have the axon, or the nerve fiber, which is a long single extension that will carry those impulses away from the cell body. So in general, our neurons are one-way roads when it comes to communication. The dendrites bring that signal in, the cell body processes it, and then the axon takes that signal away to communicate with the next neuron. So in essence, the dendrites listen and the axons talk. So here's our neuron that we can see here. Again, it's an okay image, but it does communicate all of these structures fairly well. So we have the cell body here with the nucleus. The cell body is also called the soma sometimes, so you may see that term. Know that they're the same. The dendrites, which are those short projections coming off. And then this long extension all the way down is the axon. We'll talk about some of the other structures in just a little bit, but we want to at least have the main three pieces down. And again, communication is going to happen in a one-way direction. So information is brought in through the dendrites, we process in the cell body, and then we send that signal out down through the axon, where these ends over here are called the presynaptic terminals, can talk with the dendrites from another neuron. There are three types of neurons that we see, and these neurons are going to have different functions. So sensory neurons, they're going to bring information in. So they're taking some sort of information from a sensory receptor, and they're going to send that information to the central nervous system. Think about the neurons that would take information when you touch something, the fact that you know that you touch something. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it bumpy? Is it smooth? That information is going to be brought in via receptors, and then the information will travel from the receptors to your brain via a sensory neuron. Interneurons are found in the central nervous system, and they're going to basically make sense of this information. They're going to help process. They're going to receive that information in the central nervous system. We're going to decide what it means and what to do with it, and then they're going to send instructions out to a motor neuron. The motor neuron is going to be the neuron that causes some sort of action or effect. So let's have this scenario. Someone throws a football at me. The sensory receptors in my eyes are going to bring in the visual information about this football. And there's a sensory neuron that's going to take that visual information and send it to my brain. The interneurons in my brain are going to process that information and make sense of it. What is it that we're seeing? This is visual information. What do we see? We see this brown object. It's flying towards us. What is that brown object? Oh, it's a football. What should we do with this football that's flying towards us? We should catch it. So then the interneurons are going to send information down the motor neurons to my muscles in my arms so I can reach up and catch that football. In this case, the muscles are called the effector because they're going to cause the effect of catching the ball. So let's look at kind of this process now. Here's some sensory receptors. It doesn't really matter which type of receptor they are. They're just receptors bringing some information in. We bring information along this sensory neuron. Here's the axon. We're carrying that information away to the interneuron that would be in the brain or the spinal cord. We're going to process that information. What does it mean? Let's make some sense of it. Let's decide on an action to perform in response. And then we send that information down to a motor neuron. And then that motor neuron's axon is going to communicate with whatever body part we need to cause that effect. So if we need to move, then this motor neuron will talk with muscles. If it's something about digestion, then this motor neuron can talk to the digestive organs, so on and so forth. Now, all of these neurons we've looked at are covered with this very particular kind of covering. You saw it here, right? You see these almost like pillows or like armbands or something that's wrapping around the axon. But if you notice, it's not complete. It's not completely covering the entire axon. This is called the myelin sheath. It's a lipid-based covering that's on those axons, and it's going to help increase the speed of sending that message. It's going to help regenerate, help protect those nerves, and it's also going to insulate. And there's a few different types of cells that are going to help with this. The neuroglia are primarily the ones that are going to help create this myelin sheath. Schwann cells are the neuroglia found in the peripheral nervous system to do this. And oligodendrocytes are the ones that are going to help with the central nervous system. Now, like we mentioned, there's gaps between those myelin areas on the axon called the nodes of Ranvier, and we can travel across those gaps, right, very, very quickly. So us going from one node to another, right, from one gap to another is called saltatory conduction. We're not going to get too deep into that today. Right? We're going to worry more about the nerve impulse in the next video.